I want you to stop what you're doing right now and ask yourself a question that might make you uncomfortable. When was the last time you felt truly understood? Not just heard, not just acknowledged, but genuinely understood at the deepest level of your being. If you're struggling to answer that question, you're not alone. In fact, you're part of a special group of people who have discovered something that most of society refuses to acknowledge. Sometimes the most enlightened choice you can make is to embrace solitude. You see, I've spent years studying human behavior, watching patterns, observing the choices that separate those who live authentically from those who merely exist in the shadows of other people's expectations. And here's what I've discovered. The people with the purest hearts, the clearest vision, and the strongest moral compass are often the ones who find themselves walking alone. This isn't a coincidence. This isn't a tragedy. This is a deliberate choice made by individuals who have reached a level of consciousness that most people will never achieve. Think about it for a moment. In a world where compromise has become the norm, where people bend their values like rubber bands just to fit in, where authenticity is sacrificed on the altar of social acceptance, what happens to those who refuse to play that game? What happens to the people who look at the status quo and say, no, I won't participate in this theater of mediocrity? They choose loneliness, not because they hate people, but because they love themselves too much to become someone they're not. I remember sitting in a coffee shop once, watching a group of friends laugh together at a table nearby. From the outside, it looked perfect, the kind of connection we're all supposed to want. But as I listened closer, I realized they weren't really connecting at all. They were performing. Each person was playing a role, saying what they thought would get the biggest laugh, agreeing with opinions they didn't actually hold, pretending to enjoy conversations that bored them to tears. They were together, yes, but they were profoundly alone in ways they couldn't even recognize. That's when it hit me. There are two types of loneliness in this world. There's the loneliness of the crowd, surrounded by people but unable to be yourself. And there's the loneliness of authenticity, where you're alone but completely aligned with who you truly are. The first type of loneliness is a prison. The second type is freedom. And good people, people with integrity, people who refuse to compromise their souls for temporary comfort, they choose the second type every single time. But here's what most people don't understand about this choice. When someone with a good heart chooses solitude, they're not running away from connection. They're running towards something far more valuable, a connection with themselves that's so deep, so unshakable, that it becomes the foundation for every other relationship in their life. They understand that you cannot give what you do not have, and if you don't have a solid relationship with yourself, you have nothing authentic to offer anyone else. I've watched countless people sacrifice their inner peace for the illusion of belonging. They join groups where they have to bite their tongue. They maintain friendships that drain their energy. They stay in relationships that require them to dim their light. And they call this living. But is it really living when you have to abandon yourself to be accepted by others? Is it really connection when the person people claim to love isn't actually you, but the version of you that you've constructed to please them? The good people, the ones I'm talking about, they've seen through this illusion. They've recognized that most social connections are built on foundations of sand, shared complaints, mutual insecurities, collective fears, or worse, the need to have someone validate their choices. These relationships crumble the moment someone decides to grow, to change, to become more than they were yesterday. And that's precisely why people with integrity often find themselves alone. They're committed to growth, and growth is a solitary journey. You cannot grow in a crowd. You cannot evolve while you're busy maintaining an image. You cannot discover who you really are when you're constantly worried about who other people think you should be. Growth requires space. It requires silence. It requires the courage to sit with yourself, to face your fears, to confront your limitations, and to push beyond them. And most people are terrified of that kind of solitude because it forces them to confront the gap between who they are and who they pretend to be. But good people, they welcome this confrontation. They understand that the discomfort of facing yourself is temporary, but the freedom that comes from knowing yourself is permanent. They choose short-term discomfort over long-term dishonesty. They choose temporary loneliness over permanent disconnection from their authentic self. Now, I want to be clear about something. When I say good people choose loneliness, I'm not talking about becoming antisocial or developing a superiority complex. I'm talking about becoming selective. I'm talking about choosing quality over quantity. I'm talking about understanding that your energy is sacred, your time is precious, and your peace of mind is non-negotiable. Think about the people in your life right now. How many of them actually know you? Not the version of you that you present to the world, but the real you, your dreams, your fears, your struggles, your genuine thoughts about life. How many of them would still accept you if you stopped agreeing with everything they said? How many would still want to spend time with you if you couldn't provide something they needed, entertainment, validation, resources, or emotional support? These questions aren't meant to make you paranoid or cynical. They're meant to help you understand why people with strong moral foundations often find themselves alone. It's not because they're difficult or unfriendly. It's because they refuse to engage in relationships that require them to be anything other than authentic. They refuse to pretend. They refuse to play games. They refuse to manipulate or be manipulated. And in a world where so many relationships are built on these very things, authentic people often find themselves on the outside looking in. But here's the beautiful paradox. The more comfortable you become with your own company, the more attractive you become to the right kind of people. When you stop desperately seeking connection and start radiating contentment, you begin to attract individuals who are drawn to your authenticity rather than your ability to meet their needs. You start attracting people who want to know the real you, not the version of you that makes them feel better about themselves. I've noticed something fascinating about people who've learned to embrace solitude. They have a different energy about them. They're not anxious in social situations because they're not performing. They're not constantly seeking approval because they've learned to approve of themselves. They're not afraid of silence because they've made peace with their own thoughts. They carry themselves with a quiet confidence that comes from knowing they are okay, with or without external validation. This isn't arrogance. This is self-possession. This is what happens when you stop abandoning yourself for the sake of others and start showing up as who you really are. People feel this energy, even if they can't articulate what it is. Some are drawn to it because it reminds them of what they've lost or never developed. Others are threatened by it because it highlights their own dependence on external validation. The truth is, most people are addicted to other people's opinions. They're addicted to likes, comments, approval, and acceptance. They structure their entire lives around what others think of them. They choose careers based on what looks impressive. They buy things they can't afford to maintain an image. They express opinions they don't really hold to avoid conflict. They're living their lives in response to an imaginary audience that doesn't actually care about them as much as they think. Good people, authentic people, they break free from this addiction. They realize that the only opinion that truly matters is their own, and the only approval they need is their own. This realization is simultaneously liberating and isolating. It's liberating because it frees them from the exhausting task of managing other people's perceptions. It's isolating because it sets them apart from the vast majority of people who are still trapped in the approval-seeking cycle. But isolation isn't always negative. Sometimes isolation is protection. Sometimes isolation is preservation. Sometimes isolation is the price you pay for maintaining your integrity in a world that rewards compromise. And for people who understand this, loneliness becomes not a burden to be avoided, but a sanctuary to be cherished. I want you to consider something that might challenge your assumptions about human nature. We've been taught that humans are social creatures who need constant connection to thrive. While there's truth to this, it's not the whole truth. Humans are also meaning-seeking creatures who need purpose, authenticity, and alignment with their values to truly thrive. And sometimes, the pursuit of meaning requires you to step away from social connections that don't serve your highest good. The people I'm describing, the ones who choose loneliness, they're not antisocial. They're selectively social. They understand that not every invitation deserves a yes. Not every friendship deserves their energy. Not every relationship deserves their time. They've learned to distinguish between connections that nourish their soul and connections that drain it, and they have the courage to choose the former, even if it means spending more time alone. This selective approach to relationships isn't cold or calculating. It's self-preserving. It's about recognizing that your emotional and spiritual energy is finite, and you have a responsibility to yourself to use it wisely. It's about understanding that you can't pour from an empty cup, and maintaining relationships that consistently empty your cup isn't just harmful to you, it's ultimately harmful to everyone involved. I've observed that people who embrace strategic solitude tend to have a deeper appreciation for the relationships they do maintain. When you're not spreading yourself thin across dozens of superficial connections, you can invest deeply in the few relationships that truly matter. When you're not performing for everyone, you can be genuine with those who deserve your authenticity. When you're not saying yes to everything, your yes actually means something. This approach to relationships requires emotional maturity that most people haven't developed. It requires the ability to disappoint others without feeling guilty. It requires the strength to be misunderstood without feeling compelled to explain yourself. It requires the wisdom to know that not everyone will appreciate your boundaries, and the courage to maintain them anyway. Think about the last time you said no to something you didn't want to do. How did it feel? Were you riddled with guilt? Did you spend hours crafting the perfect excuse? Did you worry about what the other person would think? If so, you're not alone. Most people have been conditioned to believe that saying no is selfish, that disappointing others is wrong, that prioritizing your own needs is somehow immoral. But good people, the ones who've learned to choose loneliness when necessary, they understand that saying no to what's wrong for you is saying yes to what's right for you. They understand that disappointing someone who wants you to be someone you're not is actually an act of honesty, not cruelty. They understand that you can't be everything to everyone without becoming nothing to yourself. This doesn't mean they are inconsiderate or insensitive. In fact, it's quite the opposite. People who are comfortable with solitude tend to be more genuinely caring in their interactions because they're not interacting from a place of need or desperation. They're not trying to get something from you, validation, entertainment, or emotional support. They're interacting from a place of choice, which makes their attention and affection more valuable, not less. I want to talk about something that might make you uncomfortable: the difference between being lonely and being alone. Loneliness is a feeling of emptiness that occurs when you're disconnected from yourself or others. Being alone is simply a state of physical solitude. You can be lonely in a crowded room, and you can be perfectly content by yourself. The people I'm describing have learned to transform aloneness from a source of loneliness into a source of strength. How do they do this? They develop what I call an internal relationship. They've learned to be their own companion, their own counselor, their own source of entertainment and comfort. They've cultivated interests that don't require other people. They've developed the ability to enjoy their own thoughts. They've made peace with silence. They've learned to find meaning in solitary activities. This internal relationship isn't developed overnight. It requires practice, patience, and a willingness to sit with discomfort. Most people avoid being alone with their thoughts because their thoughts aren't particularly pleasant companions. They are filled with regret, anxiety, self-criticism, and worry. But people who choose loneliness learn to clean up their internal dialogue. They learn to be kind to themselves. They learn to think thoughts that serve them rather than thoughts that torture them. This internal work is what separates those who choose loneliness from those who have loneliness imposed on them. The first group has developed the skills to thrive in solitude. The second group suffers in solitude because they never learned to be comfortable with themselves. The first group uses alone time for growth, reflection, and renewal. The second group uses alone time to ruminate, worry, and spiral into negative thoughts. The irony is that people who are comfortable being alone often end up with better relationships than people who are desperate for connection. When you're not needy, you're not attracted to people who want to be needed. When you're not looking for someone to complete you, you're not attracted to people who are looking to be completed. When you're whole by yourself, you attract other whole people, and relationships between whole people are infinitely more satisfying than relationships between people who are trying to fill each other's voids. But developing this level of self-sufficiency requires you to face some uncomfortable truths about yourself and your relationships. It requires you to acknowledge that some of your connections might be based on neediness rather than genuine compatibility. It requires you to recognize that some of your social activities might be forms of escapism rather than meaningful engagement. It requires you to admit that some of your relationships might be holding you back rather than helping you grow. These realizations can be painful, but they're also liberating. When you stop trying to get your emotional needs met through other people, you free yourself from the disappointment that comes when people inevitably let you down. When you stop trying to make other people happy at the expense of your own happiness, you free yourself from resentment. When you stop looking for your identity in other people's opinions, you free yourself from the anxiety of constantly managing their perceptions. This freedom comes with a price, and that price is often loneliness. But it's a different kind of loneliness than most people experience. It's not the desperate, aching loneliness of someone who feels fundamentally disconnected from the world. It's the peaceful, chosen loneliness of someone who would rather be alone than be fake. It's the empowering loneliness of someone who knows they can handle whatever life throws at them because they've learned to handle themselves. I've noticed that people who embrace this kind of loneliness often become more interesting, not less. When you're not constantly focused on fitting in, you have more mental and emotional energy to develop your own interests, pursue your own goals, and cultivate your own unique perspective on life. You become someone worth knowing, rather than someone desperately trying to be liked. This personal development often happens in the quiet moments, the solitary hours that most people fill with distractions, while others are scrolling through social media, watching meaningless television, or engaging in gossip. People who choose loneliness are reading, thinking, creating, or simply being present with their own experience. They're using their alone time productively rather than just enduring it. But here's something crucial to understand. Choosing loneliness doesn't mean giving up on human connection entirely. It means becoming more intentional about the connections you do make. It means raising your standards. It means refusing to settle for relationships that don't align with your values or contribute to your growth. It means being willing to wait for the right people rather than accepting whoever happens to be available. This waiting can be challenging, especially in a culture that promotes instant gratification and constant stimulation. We're told that if we're not constantly surrounded by people, we must be doing something wrong. We're made to feel like there's something defective about us if we prefer our own company to the company of people who don't really understand us. But what if the opposite is true? What if the ability to be content alone is actually a sign of emotional maturity? What if choosing quality over quantity in relationships is actually a sign of wisdom? What if refusing to compromise your values for the sake of social acceptance is actually a sign of strength? The people who choose loneliness have answered these questions for themselves. They've decided that their peace of mind is more important than their social calendar. They've decided that their authenticity is more important than their popularity. They've decided that their growth is more important than their comfort. And these decisions, while sometimes isolating, ultimately lead to a richer, more meaningful life. Think about the most influential people throughout history. How many of them were beloved by everyone during their lifetime? How many of them had to stand alone in their convictions before others recognized their value? How many of them chose unpopular paths because they believed those paths were right regardless of what others thought? The truth is, people who change the world are rarely the most popular people in the world. They're usually the ones willing to stand apart from the crowd, to think differently, to challenge the status quo. They're the ones who choose the discomfort of being misunderstood over the comfort of conformity. They're the ones who choose loneliness over compromise. This doesn't mean that everyone who chooses loneliness is destined for greatness, but it does mean that greatness often requires the willingness to be alone with your thoughts, your dreams, and your convictions. It requires the strength to continue moving forward even when no one is cheering you on. It requires the faith to believe in your path even when you can't see where it's leading. People who embrace strategic solitude develop this kind of inner strength. They learn to validate themselves instead of seeking validation from others. They learn to motivate themselves instead of relying on external encouragement. They learn to trust themselves instead of looking for consensus. These skills make them more resilient, more independent, and ultimately more capable of creating the life they actually want rather than the life others expect them to live. But developing these skills requires practice, and practice often happens in solitude. You can't learn to trust your own judgment if you're constantly seeking other people's opinions. You can't develop self-confidence if you're always looking for external confirmation. You can't discover what you really want if you're always focused on what others want from you. This is why good people often find themselves choosing loneliness. Not because they don't value relationships, but because they understand that the most important relationship they'll ever have is the one they have with themselves. They understand that if this relationship is strong, all other relationships will be better. If this relationship is weak, all other relationships will suffer. Actually, I want to share something with you that might change how you think about social pressure. Most of the pressure you feel to conform, to fit in, to be like everyone else, doesn't actually come from other people. It comes from your own assumptions about what other people want from you. You think people want you to agree with them, so you do. You think people want you to be available whenever they call, so you are. You think people want you to prioritize their needs over your own, so you do. But what if you're wrong? What if people actually respect you more when you have boundaries? What if they value your opinion more when it's genuinely yours, rather than a reflection of theirs? What if they appreciate your time more when you don't give it away freely to everyone? People who choose loneliness have tested these assumptions and found them to be largely false. They've discovered that when you stop trying so hard to be liked, you often become more likable. When you stop being available to everyone, people value your availability more. When you stop agreeing with everything, your agreements carry more weight. This discovery is both liberating and terrifying. It's liberating because it frees you from the exhausting task of people-pleasing. It's terrifying because it means you've been operating under false assumptions about human nature and social dynamics. It means you've been working harder than necessary to maintain relationships that might not have required so much effort. The people who navigate this discovery successfully are the ones who learn to trust their own judgment about relationships. They stop asking themselves what others want from them and start asking what they want from others. They stop focusing on being accepted and start focusing on accepting themselves. They stop trying to avoid conflict and start learning to navigate it constructively. This shift in focus often leads to a natural winnowing of relationships. Some people will drift away when you stop being who they wanted you to be. Some friendships will end when you stop enabling unhealthy dynamics. Some social groups will exclude you when you stop participating in behaviors that don't align with your values. This winnowing can be painful, but it's also necessary. It clears space in your life for relationships that are based on who you actually are rather than who you think you should be. It eliminates the energy drain of maintaining connections that don't serve you. It reduces the cognitive load of trying to remember which version of yourself you're supposed to be with which group of people. What remains after this winnowing process is often smaller in quantity, but infinitely higher in quality. You end up with a few relationships that truly nourish your soul rather than dozens that leave you feeling empty. You end up spending time with people who energize you rather than people who exhaust you. You end up in conversations that matter rather than conversations that fill time. But perhaps most importantly, you end up with a clear sense of who you are, independent of other people's opinions. You develop what I call an unshakable core, a set of values, beliefs, and characteristics that remain constant regardless of your social environment. This core becomes your guide for decision-making, your source of confidence, and your foundation for authentic relationships. Developing this unshakable core requires time alone. It requires reflection, introspection, and honest self-assessment. It requires the courage to acknowledge your flaws without being crushed by them, and the wisdom to recognize your strengths without being inflated by them. It requires the ability to sit with uncertainty while you figure out what you really believe about life, relationships, success, and happiness. Most people avoid this kind of deep self-examination because it's uncomfortable. It's easier to adopt other people's beliefs, values, and opinions than to develop your own. It's easier to follow the crowd than to chart your own path. It's easier to blend in than to stand out. But people who choose loneliness understand that easy isn't always better, and that the discomfort of self-discovery is temporary while the benefits are lifelong. This process of developing an unshakable core often makes people appear different to those around them. They become less reactive because they're not constantly seeking approval. They become more decisive because they know what they value. They become more consistent because they're not changing their personality based on their audience. They become more trustworthy because they say what they mean and mean what they say. These qualities make them attractive to some people and threatening to others. People who are secure in themselves are drawn to this kind of authenticity. People who are insecure feel exposed by it. People who are comfortable with themselves appreciate genuine interactions. People who are uncomfortable with themselves prefer superficial ones. The result is that people with unshakable cores often find themselves naturally attracting other people with unshakable cores while repelling people who are still seeking external validation. This isn't a conscious process of discrimination. It's simply the natural result of authenticity attracting authenticity and insecurity being uncomfortable around security. This dynamic can make social situations interesting for people who've chosen the path of strategic loneliness. They might find themselves feeling disconnected from groups they used to fit into easily. They might discover that conversations they used to enjoy now feel shallow or meaningless. They might realize that activities they used to participate in no longer align with their values or interests. These realizations can be isolating, but they're also clarifying. They help you understand what you've outgrown and what you're growing toward. They help you identify the relationships worth maintaining and the ones worth releasing. They help you recognize the difference between belonging somewhere because you fit in and belonging somewhere because you're accepted for who you truly are. The people who navigate this transition successfully learn to see loneliness not as a punishment, but as a gift. It's a gift of time to become who you're meant to be without interference. It's a gift of space to pursue interests that genuinely captivate you. It's a gift of silence to hear your own thoughts without the noise of other people's opinions. It's a gift of freedom to make choices based on your own values rather than social expectations.